Okay, so we should get started on the last panel of the day on transparency. Transparency is one of those things, nobody's against transparency. Nobody opposes transparency until you ask them to actually be transparent about something, in which case there can be problems. And even those who are trying in good faith to be transparent about these content moderation practices and policies have lots of questions about transparency about what? The general policies, specific actions that were taken, aggregate statistics, law enforcement actions, things like that. Does it? I was interested to hear in the previous panel, Peter was saying sometimes you give people more information and that just enables them to game the system more effectively. So that militates against sometimes full transparency. Transparency exposes mistakes, stupid things that you did. That might require, in a sense, even ethically, if not legally, that you provide, if you're going to be transparent, that you provide some sort of redress for those mistakes that you will now be revealing, etc. Lots of questions. I'm not going to do much more myself than just keep the ball rolling here. We have a panel, we have representatives from 3 of the sort of platform companies to talk about their particular strategies and policies with respect to content moderation transparency. Kevin Koehler from Automattic, Caitlin Sullivan from Facebook, and Alex Walden from Google. And we have also Rebecca Mackinnon, who is our one sort of civil society representative here. Rebecca's been working on these issues for a long time as part of the Ranking Digital Rights project at Open Technology Institute. So we thought we would ask the 3 company reps to give us a little snapshot, if they can, 5 to 10 minutes each, of how their companies sort of manage the transparency strategy, what they do, what they have decided not to do, what they might do in the future but have not yet implemented, just to give us sort of a sense of the sort of the status quo on some of these transparency questions. And then we'll ask Rebecca, as it were, from the outside looking in, to sort of comment on those, both with respect to the specific companies that are at issue here, and more broadly with respect to sort of the online world in general. So with that, I'm going to just move right to left, left to right for those of you watching at home. And do you want to start, Caitlin?
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you again to everyone for being here and for hosting a wonderful conference. Being the last panel, we'll try to keep this pretty brief for you all and keep it moving. So you've heard from my colleague, Peter, that some of the big values that our team cares about when we set the rules for Facebook are safety, voice, and fairness. And he talked about fairness being an understanding and kind of trust in our decision-making process, even if you don't always agree with it, even if you don't think we make the right decision in each and every case. And part of how we can gain your trust is by being more transparent. So just about 2 weeks ago, we released a new iteration of our community standards. So we've always had an external-facing kind of set of policies that you could read about what's allowed and not allowed on Facebook. They've gotten more transparent over the years. I think when I first started, our statement on nudity was something along the lines of, we don't allow nudity, but we understand that Michelangelo's David is artistic or something. It didn't really tell you much. And then we moved to a clearer place where we told you more, and then as of 2 weeks ago, you can go read our very detailed policies on what we consider nudity and what we don't consider nudity. And also, just to do a little myth busting while I'm out here, we do have policies against fully exposed female nipples, but we have a number of carve-outs for those that range from breastfeeding, health contexts like mastectomy and gender realignment surgeries, and also political protests, which I think someone had brought up as well. But you can now go read those details, and they're the details that our reviewers have that we actually use to enforce the policies. we also give a whole lot of background on why we do these. So it's also the first time we've been talking externally in a published way about our values of safety, voice, and fairness. And we're really doing these for 3 reasons. So we want to be clear on what we don't allow and what we have no tolerance for. We also want to help people understand the nuanced lines we draw. So you may not agree that female nipples shouldn't be allowed on Facebook, but at least now you understand exactly where we draw the line on that issue. And on many, many, many more issues, I think our rules also get simplified as being all about nudity, but of the 25 pages that you can print out, I swear not all of them have to do with that. And then we want to inform the feedback and dialogue that we enjoy engaging with. So when we meet in groups like this, when we talk to constituents like you all, we want to have a starting place of laying out on the table what we do so that you can give us feedback on it. To David's point, it does expose the difference between an enforcement error and a policy decision. We think that's generally productive to that conversation. But again, to his point, that also leads to frustration when someone has something removed and they can go cite the policy line and understand that a mistake was made. So the other thing that we announced about 2 weeks ago was more investment in our appeal system. So we've long had appeals on Facebook for basically the big things that we took down. If we took down your whole account, if we took down a whole page, if we took down a whole group, you could tell us that you think we got it wrong. We might engage in a dialogue with you and actually help you clean up something in your group or page and come back. And over the last couple years, we've been experimenting with that with individual pieces of content. And as of 2 weeks ago, we have announced this increased commitment. So what that means right now is that if you have a post, photo, video, link share kind of simple piece of content removed for nudity or sexual activity, hate speech, or graphic violence, you will be able to give us feedback on that decision, tell us if you think we made a mistake, and we will help you appeal that. And we hope to roll that out to across kind of more violation types, so more of our policy areas, and also go deeper with that experience and think about different levels of appeal that we can offer to people, what extra context we might want to review at or with the appeal. I know another thing that I'm sure Rebecca will highlight that people talk about when they talk about transparency is numbers. We talk about Facebook and we talk about this conference at being at scale. We have over 2 billion people who are monthly active on our platform. We have millions of things posted every day. We review millions of reports every day. And so part of transparency is releasing more numbers. For about the last 5 years, we've released a set of increasingly detailed numbers about government requests that we get on data and on content removal, both kind of criminal and civil cases and intellectual property cases. And you can see that at our transparency report or government request report. And just recently, we released the numbers that Peter cited about our counter-terror removals around ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We released numbers not just on how much content we removed, but what percentage was proactive versus reactive, and how long on average that content had lived on our platform, so how long it was available. This is far from perfect. It is only one very small slice of what we remove, but we hope to be getting more transparent around these numbers in the future.
Hi, yes. I represent Automattic, and more of you may be familiar with our flagship product, WordPress.com. And it's amusing and amazing to me that we usually end up being the little guy on these kind of panels, which is just goes to show how hard the at scale in content moderation is. The internet really outpaces our ability to wrap our minds around it. But I want to say a little bit about WordPress first, so you understand where we as a company sit in that ecosystem. WordPress is a free open source software that's community run and not like owned by any corporation. And anyone can install it anywhere on any host. That makes up, as best we can tell, about 30% of the sites on the internet run using WordPress, based on a scan of about the top 100 million sites. My company, Automattic and WordPress.com, does not host all of those sites on our servers or directly on our platforms. So you can stop sending us complaints about all of them. But we share the co-founder with the WordPress software, and we're a private for-profit business, and we provide hosting and cloud services like WordPress.com and a plugin called Jetpack, and like some support services for e-commerce operations through our product WooCommerce. So for our main service, WordPress.com, just to give you an idea, we have over 80 million posts a month, over 40 million comments a month, something north of 400 million unique visitors come to sites that we host on a monthly basis. And yet I'm the little guy up here. And so our mission, and in both ideologically and in our business model, is to democratize publishing, no matter who you are, where you're from, what resources you have, and really see in doing our work on trust and safety, we see the publisher as our constituent. If it's a blog or an organization or a business, small or large, professional or amateur, the publisher is really our constituent, and we try to design all of our policies and also all of our communication and transparency around that first. We're a little less of an interconnected social network, although we do have social features. It's more a constellation of publishers that we try to serve as best as we can. And so when we knew we wanted to release a transparency report, and we started on that process in 2013. Which is ancient history in tech years, but not that long ago in real people time. And so we had that in mind of publishers and their rights. And so mainly on our mind were censorship and transparency of law enforcement and government interference and those kind of things. So that's how we started with government info and takedown requests, takedown demands from governments, national security letters. Soon after, we added intellectual property to our transparency report, because copyright and trademark is definitely a way that moneyed interests try to silence speech. In our latest report, we're adding, it goes up through the end of 2017, we've added a list of all the sites that we geoblock to comply with local laws and keep sites online in censory regimes, as well as some more information about internet referral units and how we respond to their requests. And it's online at transparency.automattic.com. And we also try to write and blog as much as we can, which is not nearly as much as we'd like, about some of the context for understanding that, so it's not just raw numbers. And the numbers are not as much discussed here today, but I mean, they can be interesting. Just since we've started keeping track, our copyright reports per period have gone up about 2 times. Our info requests from government have gone up about 3 times what they once were, and our government takedown demands have gone up about 145 times what they once were. To give you a sense of how the internet and our relationship with society is changing. And so our goal with transparency reports is just one element of transparency, and we see it as a way to communicate with our users and our publishers to let them know, when and how we have their back in resisting censorship and things like that. And we find those kind of numbers useful internally, and whenever we have something useful internally, we try to release it, because we're from the open source world. We want to put everything but passwords online, pretty much, if we can. And it's also to provide info for civil society, to go back to that goal of democratizing publishing and making sure all these things are above board and out in the open, and that everyone can really understand how that takedown and pushback and content policies work. We're a relatively small team in the Facebook, Google world. My team is slightly larger than this panel. It's about 4 of us that do terms of service kind of work full time, and the legal team's about 4. We have outside counsel as well. People have different responsibilities, but everyone does a little bit of everything. We try a philosophy of ours is to try not to get policy making too detached from the day-to-day context of what people are experiencing on our platform every day. So we don't have separate teams when it comes to writing transparency reports or policy or explaining decisions. It's all, we all share in that work to try to make it as best as we can and not get it too abstract from the day-to-day things that people experience when they're interacting online with WordPress. And so when it comes to like writing the transparency report, not everything is automated. Some of it is. Some of it we keep in spreadsheets. It's copy and pasting. So we can't necessarily always scale to put out all the information that we like. And so whenever we're determining what kind of information we want to put out, we're thinking, like, is the time we spent delivering value to people, is it like increasing their understanding, or are we not releasing enough to really contextualize what's happening to the point where they might misunderstand what's going on? It's actually a lot more philosophical and complicated as you might imagine, especially as you can tell from today how every service is a little bit different. And we all have different kinds of communities and people using our platforms, and they're all interacting in different ways. So we try to speak a common language where you understand where each platform stands and what our rules are. But since content is so different and platforms are so different, that can definitely be a challenge. And so we want everything in our report to be clear and understandable to someone who doesn't need to spend hours and hours figuring out WordPress. They can just kind of get a sense of it from when they read it. And so there are, some things that, maybe Facebook and Google do that we're very jealous of, but we determine is more of a nice to have instead of like an essential for helping people understand how content moderation and law enforcement and international censorship work. So the other area of transparency is really when it comes to like particular removals and communicating what we're doing and why, and providing an appeals process and redress when we make mistakes. It happens with both robots and humans, hopefully not often, but it definitely happens. And so a focus that we've always had is having on clear guidelines that are public and easy to understand as we can make them, and not too long to read. People don't want to read a big wall of text. We don't want to repeat the terms of service kind of, subsection 14C kind of problem when it comes to our community guidelines and standards of what we will remove or will not. And we're always revisiting that periodically throughout every year, as well as how we communicate every suspension, the reasons we provide. We evaluate, are people able to find the appeals processes that they need if we do screw up, to make sure people aren't locked out in any way, and they always have an answer if your content is removed for whatever reason. And we definitely are super focused on any time there's any kind of legal process for government that, to the fullest extent allowable by law, to get all the information about any of that promptly if it concerns your site. So we do focus when it comes to like our content policies and policing. We haven't approached publishing numbers yet. We may revisit that someday. But our focus for transparency is being very clear with each individual removal, making those policies as clear and seen as we can. And one of my predecessors has a phrase that I've always liked, that we want to be the best service you ever got kicked out of. So even if you're a bad actor and you did terrible things on the service, even for those people, we want them to have a clear explanation of why they were kicked out. Not detailed enough that they can game our systems, but enough so that everyone knows where they stand and what's acceptable and what's not on our platform. So that's just a broad, quick overview of where we stand on transparency.
Kevin, can I just ask a quick question, just to clarify? You said 145 times increase in government takedowns. Is that law enforcement?
That's generally foreign governments, and law enforcement, it's hard to categorize the different executive agencies and courts that have jurisdiction there. That's largely driven by Russia, former Soviet republics, and Turkey, as where a lot of the censorship demands have really increased. But we're seeing it in all kinds of new countries that never sent us any kind of notices before, or suddenly sending us notices demanding that we take things down, sometimes in a friendly manner, sometimes like 24 hours or else. And so we have to make some complicated decisions there. But we do try to publish those as much as we can. And the report is transparency.automattic.com. We're always open to hearing from people what they find useful or what they don't understand, because we're always fine-tuning and looking for ways we can release more in a sustainable fashion that we'll be able to keep up with, that delivers value to people, just everyday people, and especially, of course, researchers.
Great. Alex?
So thanks for including us on the panel today. I will also try to do a relatively brief overview of YouTube's recent transparency report. So just to start off, I want to kind of set the ground rules for YouTube. YouTube has 4 values, 4 freedoms that it uses as the foundation for how it thinks about how it can preserve and balance the kind of community it wants to have. Those freedoms are freedom of expression, freedom of information, freedom of opportunity, and freedom to belong. Our community guidelines are set up in such a way so that we can be thoughtful and responsible about the ways we preserve and balance all of those issues. We want to make sure that YouTube stays sort of the safe and vibrant community that it is today. Many of you may have heard this before, but there are over 400 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute. And that really means that it's one of the sort of richest and largest collections of human culture, of live human culture that we have today. And so we really see that we have a responsibility to try to protect that ethos of YouTube. So what we did on April 23rd is we released the first ever YouTube transparency report that gives sort of an unprecedented amount of information about the kind of content that we remove under our own community guidelines, under our enforcement. We recognize that being more transparent about how we enforce our community guidelines is important in terms of how we maintain our responsibility to be transparent with our users and with the general public. So we sort of first embarked on this in 2010 when we released our first government removal transparency report. We sort of began by including information about requests for user data and government requests to remove information, and that ultimately expanded sort of each half year after half year to include a much broader set of data: copyright removals, right to be forgotten removal requests in the EU, and you can probably see how every time we publish it, it includes more and more information. What the YouTube Transparency Report includes is data of Q4 2017, so October through December of 2017. This includes information about content that we remove across a broad range of policies. Those are sexual, spam and misleading, hateful and abusive, violent or repulsive, dangerous, harmful acts, and then promotes terrorism. So we wanted to make sure that as we're moving forward, we're giving people more and more insight into the kinds of ways that we're removing content. It's important to understand that we care about removing like I said, 400 hours per minute. And so we're dealing at a humongous scale. And so we need to make sure we're using all of the tools available to us to remove that content that violates our policies. An important way in which we do that is through using machine learning. We announced in, I think it was June of last year, that we were doubling down on the way we were using machine learning to help us identify, in that instance, particularly terrorist content as it appears on our platform. We've learned through that process that including experts as part of the way we learn to identify content is really key. One of the things I want to point out about the transparency report is that it demonstrates the kind of content that is flagged by humans versus what is flagged automatically. You can see that users across the board are flagging content, but our average users are flagging a high volume of content, but the accuracy rates are relatively low. And then we have some users, like those in our Trusted Flagger program, who flag a relatively small amount of content, but their accuracy rates are relatively high. All of those are important inputs in the way that we enforce our guidelines. I know many of you have sort of looked at the report, so I don't want to walk through all of the things, but I think it's important to highlight that 8 million videos were removed for violating our community guidelines in that quarter, and nearly 81% of that were flagged by using machine learning. So as we've heard Facebook and many of the other companies talk about, we see technology as being an important part of how we deal with these problems at scale. But to be clear, humans will be an important part of that process going forward. When content is flagged either by humans or machines, it is reviewed by our reviewers. Our reviewing team sits all around the world. There are people that review those 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We committed, I think it was in December of last year, to increasing the number of the increasing the size of the team that reviews content to 10,000 in 2018. And we're already making progress to doing that. So again, humans are a very important part of the process for us. One of the ways that we have learned to deal with the scale problem is by looking at spam. The way we deal with spam has really informed some of the ways we were dealing with other kinds of content. An additional way in which we've been increasingly dealing with the scale is by focusing on content that we've already taken down. When we take down a piece of content that violates our community guidelines, we can automatically prevent the re-upload of that content, and that helps us deal with the scale problem. One thing that's come up on the panel that's important to highlight is the importance of an appeals process. We certainly have had an appeals process for a long time, and anyone that has a piece of content removed is provided notice and the ability to appeal. And we have various articles in our help center to help users understand the ways in which that process will go forward. And then lastly, when we released our transparency report on the 23rd, we also released a new user dashboard that lets users who flag content understand where that flag is in the process of review. We've heard from a lot of folks that when they flag a piece of content, they want to know what's happening to it. Has it been reviewed? Has it been removed? Is it going to remain live? And the user dashboard is something that's been available to our trusted flaggers for a long time, but we wanted to make it more broadly available to users. So that's another way in which we've tried to increase transparency for users who are actually doing the flagging. I think that I've covered sort of the highlights of the report, but I'm very interested in the questions and certainly interested in hearing from Rebecca.
Okay, Rebecca, you get your turn.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm here primarily in my capacity of director of the Ranking Digital Rights Project, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I've been dealing with content moderation issues for, I guess, probably about 12 years, sort of as a writer, researcher, an advocate, co-founder of a global citizen media community called Global Voices, and also as a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I've been interacting with companies on behalf of journalists and activists around the world who've had content taken down and accounts deactivated and trying to help figure out what happened, and kind of writing and engaging about the problem for a long time. And so why does transparency matter for people out there who use the platforms? And how is this whole content moderation process affecting them? I think from the perspective of most users out there in the world, and we are talking here about platforms used by people all over the place, except maybe North Korea, and even in China to some extent. So, you know, what does it feel like and look like when a piece of content is deleted or an account is deactivated? It can be quite disorienting and confusing. One example that I recall dealing with, I lived in Hong Kong for a little while in 2007, 2008. And there was a year when, around the time of the June 4th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, a bunch of activists who were posting a lot of content critical of the Chinese Communist Party and its denial of the massacre, all started getting content removed and accounts deactivated. And they didn't know why, and they couldn't talk to a human being, and so on. And so they assumed that the Chinese government had gotten to the platform that was particularly deleting a lot of content and deactivating a lot of accounts. And because there was no transparency, even, you know, the people I spoke to, you know, I said, you know, it's probably more complicated than that, but people didn't believe it. You know, they're like, okay, you know, Facebook's doing the Communist Party's bidding. And especially for people out there who you know, who are subject to censorship, surveillance, and so on, having no sense of why this is happening or who to hold accountable is particularly disempowering. And another thing that's been going on more recently is a number of activist groups have been tracking governments that are claiming to have special relationships with Facebook or with Twitter or with YouTube, so that we now have a special channel to get them to take down stuff we don't like and making statements in the newspaper. And people have no way to know if that's true or not, right? I mean, the companies will kind of make fairly oblique statements in response to those government statements, and people on the ground don't know what to believe. And yes, there are transparency reports, but those are just for official government demands, and it's unclear whether there are other trusted flagger relationships going on or what. There's just a real lack of transparency about why content is going down. And in the context of a world where civil society is increasingly under attack, human rights groups are increasingly under attack, censorship is growing in a lot of countries, lack of transparency and lack of clarity about why people can or cannot say and do certain things on the world's most powerful platforms just adds to the sense of lack of control and disempowerment. And so I just want to, we've been talking very clinically and technically all day about content moderation, and so I just thought I'd kind of insert a little bit of sort of how it feels on the other end when you're an activist in Egypt and your attempts to document police violence are getting taken down by the platform you've chosen to post them onto, and you don't know why. So that's, I just thought I'd kind of start with that. Now, I'm going to switch gears really fast due to time to the Ranking Digital Rights Project. I'm not going to do a whole presentation on it. Obviously, you can go to rankingdigitalrights.org and see exactly what we do. But we evaluate, since 2005, we've been producing what we call the Corporate Accountability Index, which evaluates 22 of the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on their disclosed commitments and policies affecting users, freedom of expression, and privacy. And you can go online and you can see all the companies that we evaluate and all the 35 indicators that we use to evaluate the companies, and I won't get into the whole list here. But in terms of what we evaluate in the context of content moderation, we consider this a human rights issue, and I'm pleased to say that the industry has progressed a lot. I had a conversation, I would say, about 10 years ago with an executive of a platform that I won't name, in which I was bringing up the case of an activist who'd had their account deactivated for unknown reasons, and this executive is like, why is this a human rights issue? I'm glad we've gotten beyond that. But when we're looking at companies, what we are looking for, we have a category of questions that we call freedom of expression questions. And we are not evaluating companies based on who provides the greatest free-for-all and they get the highest score. We're looking at freedom in the context of human rights. We're looking at freedom of expression in the context of human rights. And you do not have freedom in a human rights context without governance. If you have no rules, you have a state of nature, and life is nasty, brutish, and short for everybody who is not the largest and the best financed and the nastiest, right? So we are looking to see, when we're looking to see whether a company is respecting users' freedom of expression, we're expecting that there will be rules. We're expecting that people will not be allowed to use a platform to organize a massacre of their neighboring village. But what we are expecting is that the rules are accountable, right? That the rules are clear, that the governed know what the rules are, the governed have an ability to provide input into the rules, and that there is transparency and accountability about how the rules are enforced, and information about the results of that enforcement. We're also looking to see that there is impact assessment. So we have in addition to a couple indicators in our freedom of expression category where we're looking for companies to be transparent about what their rules are and how they're enforced, and then also produce data about the volume and nature of information that has been deleted or restricted, both to enforce terms of service and also in response to all the different types of external requests you get. We're also looking in another category that we call governance. We're looking for whether there's human rights impact assessment. And we're looking for companies to conduct human rights impact assessment, not just on how government demands and the company's response to government demands affect the human rights of users, but how terms of service enforcement is affecting the human rights of users. And so companies will not get full score on their human rights assessment disclosure indicator unless we're seeing that they conduct human rights impact assessment on terms of service enforcement in addition to on government requests. We're also looking to see if the companies are clearly disclosing that they have adequate grievance and remedy mechanisms. So when people feel that their rights have been violated by the platform or in processes of the company's business operations, that they have sufficient means to both report grievance and get redress, and that there's evidence that the company is doing something about the grievances they're receiving. So that's kind of the overview of what we're looking at. And I can say just in terms of, you can go on the website and see how everybody scored. Our ranking, our scoring was closed. Our analysis and scoring process ended before the companies, Google and Facebook particularly, recently announced a bunch of new policies. So our 2019 index will then reflect those policies. But what's interesting is that in our question that's looking at transparency reporting on terms of service enforcement, when we first started examining companies' disclosures in 2015, everybody got a 0, it was a flat line. And then our second index in 2017, there were some tiny little percentages. There was a bit of kind of ad hoc disclosure from 3 companies. Nobody else was disclosing anything. This year, we had 4 companies. Facebook was added to the list of companies that were disclosing some information. And now with the latest disclosures, which will go into our next index, we'll see even more disclosure on that. And so that's really great, because we've had conversations with a number of companies over several years about, well, what do you want us to disclose? How do we disclose it? What's the point? And it's, I really congratulate those of you who figured out how to start beginning to disclose data, because it's, I think, really important for users to be able to see, and advocates for users' rights to be able to say, okay, what percentage are automated? What are the different percentages of subject matter? Super flaggers or trusted flaggers? What types of people are having that status, and how much content are they getting taken down? These things are really important for people out there to understand what's happening and knowing who to hold accountable. Really important. We're also seeing increasing over time disclosure about the process for enforcement, and that disclosure is clearly going to go up even more. And so one thing I'd also point to before I stop talking and we can have more of a conversation is that there's a great document that just got released this morning called the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability Around Online Content Moderation. And it issues a set of guidelines basically for the types of things that would be nice to see the industry as a whole disclosing. So I don't think that the URL for that is particularly short, so I can't repeat it here, but you can try Googling it, or I think if you go to the hashtag for this conference, and people tweeted it there and so on. But I think that's a really good start of a conversation about, what types of information and data need to be disclosed, and it also talks about the remedy piece as well, and the need to have that. I would suggest adding human rights impact assessment. I think we need to see evidence that companies, when they are developing their terms of service and developing their systems for terms of service enforcement, are conducting a comprehensive impact assessment on how that whole process, how the rules and their enforcement are affecting the human rights of users around the world. In the recent congressional hearings, there were calls for a civil rights audit, which is kind of a related thing. But I think there needs to be, and it's too bad we don't have anybody here who can kind of speak from that perspective. But I think we do need to have comprehensive evaluation in a systematic way of just how good are these policies doing in terms of respecting and protecting people's rights. And I think the other part of that is engagement with affected stakeholder communities, and how do you ensure that as you're continuing to refine and develop your rules and refine the way in which they're enforced, that you're hearing sufficiently from the various communities who are being affected when the mistakes are made. When the Rohingya activists are having content deleted because they're criticizing the racists who are calling for their massacre because the flagging system mistook them as hate speech. How do you correct for that, and how do you work with these groups to correct for that? It's for better or worse, there's too many people who don't have other outlets to carry out activism, to conduct journalism, to get information out, and to organize. And it's I just commend everybody for trying to get this right, and everybody who's working with the companies to try and help them get it right, because it really, really matters. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's see, we have some questions that were posted to the list, but I guess I would ask, starting again with Rebecca, maybe, and working backwards in a way. For you, sort of, what's the incentive to do it? Given what do you say to a company that does it's not free. It will involve resources, and I guess from the panelists, I'd like to hear, particularly with respect to like appeal and redress issues. Those seem to me to be, that could be prodigiously expensive, I would assume, for any of the companies here on the scale that they're operating. So how, on the one hand, what are the incentives to do it, and how are the companies sort of dealing with the possibility that they're opening themselves up to just costs that will be outlandish?
So I think there's a number of incentives. One has, I think Germany provides one example of an incentive, which is you'll get regulated really badly if you do nothing and maintain the status quo. There's a law in Germany that's requiring companies to basically take down illegal speech, but there's no actual judicial or government decision-making involved. They basically want the companies to kind of play the role of public authority and make these decisions. And in part, that's kind of a result of just, I mean, let's face it, it's hard. It's hard for companies to figure out how to police, bad content effectively and not also affect, free expression. But there's going to be increasing bad regulation, I think, if the companies do nothing. And then the other problem is the regulation comes in telling companies you have to do a better job of taking down the hate speech, the terrorism, and so on. But if the quality of content moderation remains at its present state, the result will be even more journalists and activists getting caught in the net. And you know, the collateral censorship is going to go up. So companies need to be more transparent about what's happening so governments understand just the difficulty of the problem and can have a more nuanced conversation about what real solutions might look like. But also, I think the more transparency you have, the more likely you are to have conversations with stakeholders who can help you figure out how to solve the problem better. So that's one thing. And the other kind of related issue is that, you know, it's about your relationship with your users and trust. And if people just decide that you know, if you're not being transparent, particularly users in places where there's generally no incentive to trust anybody with power, and that most entities with power are not transparent, and you're just another one of them, they're going to view you kind of similarly. And if that's the relationship you want to have with your users, and if you feel that that type of relationship is good for your business and your brand, you know, okay, but perhaps not. So.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from you.
Okay. Well, just to add to what Rebecca said, I think for us, it really comes from a value standpoint. Transparency is very much in alignment with our longstanding values around access to information. And that's sort of why we launched a transparency report originally in 2010. And that's sort of how we got to where we are now. And the other piece I want to underscore about how we got to where we are now is what Rebecca hit on about stakeholder engagement. We have long been working with and talking to many of the groups in this room about why we need this, sort of why all of the reasons we did government transparency 8 years ago are the reasons we need to have more transparency now. And so that engagement, that deep engagement with groups has helped us get to where we are today. And I think all of the ways in which we hope to further expand what we just released are going to be informed continually by our conversations with those groups.
Yeah, as far as, I mean, I agree with all that. It's like, it's in our values, like the publisher, the people that use WordPress.com are not a resource to be exploited. They're someone to make happy and serve so that they want to keep doing business with us. So you can't just say, trust us, and they'll trust you. You need to be, you know, clear as within any relationship. And I think that's been fundamental, not just to how like our trust and safety team operates, but how everyone in our company has tried to operate throughout history. So that's not too much of a stretch for us. The difficulty comes in like the finer points of practicality. What kind of transparency is good? What kind of transparency informs people, and what doesn't? As far as appeals go, I don't see appeals as an expense. I don't set our budgets or anything, but I could not do my job without an appeals and redress process, because we would have no idea how our policies are working or how our individual judgments are working if we didn't get feedback when we screwed something up and got something wrong. And so like we really need that appeals process. That's incredibly valuable source of information for us. Most people who appeal we will not agree with, and we will, you know, not reevaluate our interpretations. But for like those few who do show us that like there's a good use of the platform, that we were punishing too harshly, or there was context we weren't understanding in a particular culture or a particular place, really the most valuable way we can learn that information is through the appeals, is through the people who know that content that they were publishing better than anyone else. So I don't think we would ever remove or reduce the way that our appeals process works. We might try to make it more efficient, but we really need that feedback loop, or things could very quickly get out of hand when you're a relatively few number of people trying to be fair to an entire global group of people.
Yeah, I would just kind of build on what Kevin was saying and our theme of today of known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Transparency is how we start to know more of those unknowns. When we are transparent about our policies, we can engage more meaningfully with stakeholders, which we do on a regular basis and have been for years, but it benefits us to all start at the same, more transparent, more knowledgeable place of what our policies are to get better feedback and kind of more implementable feedback from people. And, just echoing Kevin's points on the appeals point, it's how people tell us we got it wrong. It's how people tell us that we got our enforcement wrong, and it's also how people tell us our policies were in the wrong place for them. And we've done this through the appeals that Facebook has had for a long time, through kind of informal appeals within our systems where our reviewers regularly and have lots of open channels to ask my team questions where they'll kind of appeal to us or escalate to us. We'll answer the questions, but a lot of times, and I'm looking at Peter because he's seen us do this, we'll all huddle around someone's computer and look at the example and talk it through, because a lot of these things are nuanced and they are hard, and when someone gives us more information, we want to take that information and get smarter.
Yeah, and it helps to cover more ground as well. There are all civil society groups and researchers for a lot of categories of content and for activists in certain countries, but maybe not in other places. They're maybe less well represented by research and civil society groups. So that direct feedback becomes very valuable when you're dealing with a country you're not familiar with, that you may not have many employees in, or just some kind of in the grand scheme of things, fairly obscure subculture in a certain kind of business or fan community that is maybe not a big deal in the grand scheme of global society, but is a very big deal to those people, those individuals. And we want to get it right for them too. And that's another way that appeals are invaluable.
Just to add to the appeals conversation, I think the other important thing not to be missed is that remedy is an important part of a human rights framework. And so if you are a company that commits yourself to sort of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and you think about what does it mean to be removing content, on the other end, you have to be thinking about what does it mean to remedy when you make an error. And so appeals is sort of the way in which that happens for us on this platform.
And the challenge, though, is scale, because we try to make it as efficient and human as possible. If you appeal something on WordPress.com, at least one human, maybe multiple humans, will review it and try to look at the context. But in order to do that for everyone and to do it in an efficient manner, so you're not waiting weeks for answers, it's a tough balance to strike. And sometimes we do a good job, and sometimes we don't. And we think we're being clear, about how the process works or how they can appeal things, but the messages aren't always get through, and so we're always trying to reevaluate that and improve that if we can, without getting too bogged down in any individual case, which leaves other people waiting or lacking for answers.
So Rebecca, present company excluded, of course. What's your sense of how the major platforms are doing on the sort of appeals and redress front?
In terms of what's disclosed, so we can't go onto all the platforms with test accounts and kind of post every possible kind of thing that might get deleted and then test the redress experience. But in terms of what companies are disclosing about their policies, they could do a lot better, all of them. I mean, none of them are doing great in terms of really helping us get a comprehensive view of what the policies are, what the practices are, and how what the companies learn is actually feeding back into improving the policies. It's very difficult to see.
Someone asked a question. I guess we have about 5 minutes left. So, but someone sent in a question about tying into the previous panel about machine learning. It seems to me that there is, I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, there is a tension between the use of automated tools, or at least I think there's a tension between the use of the automated tools and providing the information to people about how those tools work. What are they looking for? You don't want to give people the tools to game it, whether it's copyright infringement or pick nudity. photos or what have you. You may not want to give people the information about, A, you may not want to give people the information to game the system. B, it might be proprietary if you're using a third-party package from someone to do the analysis. They may not let you disclose exactly how it's working to determine what's possibly taken off. Is that a sort of an inherent conflict? Is that as we use more and more machine learning to help moderate, does that sort of necessarily lead to a situation where you can be as transparent as you want about how many things you've taken down and government requests and all that, but a huge number, there's this huge black hole where people really don't know exactly what's happening to their postings. It was taken down because it was flagged as copyright infringement or nudity or whatever. Is that sort of an inherent problem that can't go away, or is it going away? Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things there to unpack, and I think the first thing is just kind of transparency versus gameability, which came up on the last platform, our panel as well, that if you tell people more about why their content removed, they can figure out a way to get around your rules and post something else. That's definitely a concern, and there are areas where that's more of a concern. As the last panel said, machines are actually better at doing that than people. So if we were to release every single detail of what our automated systems look for in spam, we'd be very worried about that. But the other way to talk about gaming the system is learning how to follow the rules. And we want people to learn how to follow the rules. And if we have drawn a clear red line between what's allowed and what's not allowed, that means you are allowed to get as close to that red line as you possibly can without going over it. And so we really look at transparency as a good thing in that way. I actually want you to know just how much graphic violence you can post to expose the genocide that's going on in your country, short of having that removed from Facebook for being problematic for viewers. I want you to know that so you can make informed and empowered decisions, going back to this feeling that the lack of transparency leads people to feel disempowered. I want you to know what's going to happen so you can make really empowered decisions, and then also so you can give us feedback on that rule. And so part of what we've done with our detailed set of rules is we will be updating those every month as well, because our policies are constantly changing and constantly evolving, and we want to make sure the public has our latest version. So we'll be updating those every month. I think the second point you talked about was if machines do more of the removals, can we give people the really detailed reason as to why their content was removed? So we've come a long way in doing this at Facebook. We still have quite a ways to go, but it used to be that when a reviewer reviewed content, they had two choices: remove or ignore. And that was all of the information we logged and stored, so we could not give any more information to people because we didn't have any more information ourselves. It was all in the reviewer's head. Now we say remove or ignore, and if the answer is remove, we ask more questions to get at why. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons to do with tracking and quality so that we can release more data, but also so that we can tell the person why. So now if you have something removed on Facebook, we'll say, hey, you had a photo removed for violating our nudity and sexual activity policy. We don't go so much more detailed yet because we don't, have that information, and there are trade-offs too there with the time. The more questions I ask every reviewer about why they removed something, the fewer things they can review in the same amount of time. But Tarleton actually had tweeted out earlier that as we rely increasingly on machine learning and automation, that is one of the risks, is the machine can say, based off pattern of thing that I learned to recognize, this fits the pattern with 99% confidence. But they cannot say, this video showed this kind of part of a charred and burning body, and that's what made it a delete violation. And so that is a trade-off with just kind of what a machine is trained on, what it's telling you, and then how much of that is just not even information you can choose to be transparent about, but information you have in order to be transparent about with users.
Any other thoughts on that from, Rebecca,
yeah, I mean, I think that's always going to be a tough challenge. with machine-based removals as well as with human-based removals is revealing enough to be transparent, but not too much to be gained. I do think that it comes to like limiting machine learning, so the machine learning is just like automatically like a huge prior restraint machine on the entire world without any transparency. You can limit the things that you use it for, and then there's always humans involved to kind of check it, because it's not machine learning is not magic. It's just an algorithm. But also I think like the context people need to appeal or to tell you that your algorithm is getting things wrong is not the same context that an algorithm uses. Like an algorithm looks at like all kinds of patterns about devices and things, and where people are coming from, what they're doing, in particular content things that are very abstract. But a person saying, "Oh, look, like this protest that involves nudity is repeatedly being removed, and you should understand that political context," like having that feedback into the system to check the algorithms, whether from inside or outside the company, I think is the way you get some control and some transparency on that. Exactly the form that takes is something I think we're figuring out and will probably continue to for a while.
Yeah, I mean, Caitlin talked about power, and I mean, when you think about the longer term, and if you think about society and kind of society's perspective on this and the impact on society, right? I mean, what can we actually sustain societies in which democratic discourse is possible and in which power can be held accountable unless we can know who is shaping what we see and do not see across our digital platforms, and who is shaping what we can and cannot do across our digital platforms and services. And if we cannot know that, and if we cannot hold responsible, identify and hold responsible abuses of that power, whether the abuse is coming from a mindless computer or a human being, if that cannot be corrected for, and if there's no constraint on that, we're not going to have democracy. I mean, that's ultimately what it's all about.
Well, on that note, one thing I learned at panel moderation school is, especially if you're the last panel of the day, don't run too much over people, really. Not if there's a happy hour to come, particularly. So thank you to our panelists. Someone is going to give concluding remarks. Eric, are you in charge of that? Gary? Okay. But thanks to our panelists. Thank you. Great.